Hi everyone, thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Lindsay Johnson and I'm part of the Uncommon Conversations team here at Worldwide. We have worked with Kineticos Life Sciences to survey top executives from biopharmaceuticals to create a confidence index and measure sentiments about our industry. For the Q1 results, we've established a webinar series to discuss these findings with industry experts. I'll turn it over to Philip, who will be moderating this first discussion, Fundamentals of Running a Biopharmaceutical. Enjoy!
I want to thank everybody for joining us today for our first in a series of weekly panel discussions covering this Q1 edition of the 2020 Biopharma Confidence Index, co-sponsored by Kineticos Life Sciences and Worldwide Clinical Trials. The Biopharma Confidence Index, or BCI, is intended to be a forward-looking index designed to measure C-suite and executive leadership sentiment in the biopharma industry by asking questions about their confidence levels concerning key issues. We look for the BCI to become a valuable and highly sought-after resource for its key insights across both key industry-related issues and business functions, including capital markets, deal landscape, mergers and acquisitions, clinical development, regulatory affairs, commercialization, and overall business models. We surveyed a total of 112 respondents and broke those responses into cohorts of private companies, startup companies, and mid-sized to large pharma. I want to start today by thanking our four panelists who are joining us. We have with us today Peter Benton, President and Chief Operating Officer for Worldwide Clinical Trials. Peter, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
We also have with us Kevin Hampton, Senior Vice President of Biopharma at Kineticos.
Glad to be here and glad to be a part of this.
We also have Tom Zetlow, who is an operating executive for Kineticos.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And then Dan McCormick, who's also another Senior Vice President for Biopharma at Kineticos. Dan, thanks for doing this.
Thank you, Philip. Look forward to the discussion.
I am Philip Galinas, Chief Commercial Officer for Kineticos, and I'll be your moderator. Over this quarter, we'll deliver 5 panel discussions covering specific sections of the BCI. With the first section, we'll cover the fundamental elements of running a biopharmaceutical, followed by section 2, which will get into impact of new technologies and new approaches to markets. Section 3 will discuss raising capital, mergers, and acquisition. Section 4 will be about in-licensing and out-licensing assets, outsourcing and globalization of key activities. And finally, Section 5 will deal with current sales and marketing concepts, political pressures, and overarching economic issues. Today, we start off with the fundamental elements of running a biopharmaceutical company. The data we're sharing today is based only on those respondents who acknowledged a high confidence level, that is an 8 or above, related to a scoring scale from 1, meaning no confidence or not important, up to 10, a high confidence or highly important. So our first set of questions that we're going to talk about are fundamental elements of running a biopharmaceutical company, dealt with the confidence of our respondents regarding their company's capabilities to address specific critical development functions. We look at how confident they are in their company's capabilities associated to the following: 1, clinical development; 2, CMC, or specifically chemistry, manufacturing, and controls; and then 3rd, patient recruitment. Looking at the data, clinical development is viewed as a core competency or capability for all biopharmas, regardless of size or maturity. My first question is with this confidence across all sizes and types of companies, Is this your experience? Is this level of sophistication and experience similar or should be similar across all company types? Or is this just a reflection and the reality that the CRO expertise is available to all of these companies and used by all size companies? Peter, would you like to start off and maybe speak to that?
Sure. I'll kind of start going from the right to the left. If we look at patient recruitment, I think that we find some of the private and smaller startup companies are either unsure of what patient recruitment, where the best place to find the sites are, or they may actually be overconfident in that they've kind of taken key sites, key opinion leader sites, known experts, and potentially inflated what the recruitment is going to be. And sometimes well-known key opinion leader sites are highly successful, but that's not replicatable to other sites. And sometimes they're also potentially overconfident in their ability. And so I think the expertise they're looking for is not only to help them figure out what sites they want to go to, but also really understand any forecasted enrollment rates or recruitment is reality. And so you don't want to overestimate or underestimate what a site is really capable of doing. So I think that's when someone's really looking for a CRO partner to go support them with that. With CMC, it is most likely in a large pharmaceutical company, it's part of the inner fabric of what they do. For a smaller company, that is almost always outsourced. And what we find in startups and smaller private companies, when they outsource CMC, sometimes they outsource to a CRO to run the trial, they outsource manufacturing and scale up, et cetera, to a CMC manufacturer. I don't know that they spend the time to make sure that those are really well integrated. And we've seen cases where a drug manufacturer doesn't have a legal entity in a country we need to ship drug to, so you need an agent of record or other importation issues. And so I think one of the things that people need to be careful about is if you're going to outsource to multiple vendors, a CRO to run your clinical program, a different CRO to go manage your CMC, that you're really taking an integrated, holistic approach and really ensuring there's good communication across those different vendors.
Thanks, Peter. And Kevin, just following up, I think it's kind of interesting when we look at the data, there again seems to be this lower confidence across CMC, but especially with patient recruitment in the startups. And just wondering, with your viewpoint of that, why that might be. Is there anything that you know from engaging these types of companies on a regular basis?
Something we think about certainly more and more these days as we've taken on a new endeavor here at Kineticos and have started incubating companies. And I think it's something that we have to think about as we help these companies get off the ground. More than anything, I think we need to do a good job, specifically with the startups and probably more so with the private companies, informing them on who are the partners to work with out. In today's model, there are a myriad of external consultants or service providers that can fill all these needs. So that's why it was interesting looking at the data. While clinical development, the confidence was the highest among all three segments, that some of those things dropped off. So it begs the question, do those that are outsourcing or confident in their clinical development capabilities, I'm drawing the conclusion that it's because they know there are partners out there that can help them get through that if they don't have the internal capabilities. And one would think that it's the same with CMC and patient recruitment, that if you don't have the internal expertise or the know-how or the capabilities or the bandwidth, that there are partners out there that can help with both of those things. So I thought it was interesting. Certainly, I think there's some overlap between clinical development and patient recruitment. It goes hand in hand. But the CMC, you would expect that there are known partners out there that can help with those types of things. So I thought it was interesting to see the variance across the three. But again, in the world I live in the early stage biopharma world, we're talking about clinical stage, non-revenue generating companies. You're developing a drug. If you don't have confidence in your clinical development capabilities, whether that's internal or external, then that's an issue. I think that getting the science is the tough part. And then if you get good science and have a good drug going through the clinic, then it's an issue if you're not able to progress it. But I think that's what I have to add to that.
And one thing I was just going to throw out, it was something I was thinking about. And one of the things I thought was with patient recruitment is We know where the clinical trials are, right? The majority of them are in oncology and then followed up by CNS. Are we seeing the fact that we've got a lot competing for a limited number of patients available for those clinical trials? Is this purely a view of what we see with the majority of patients? Respondents here talking about the competition for patients in that oncology space. Is that a true statement to make based on the data that you saw, Tom?
I think that's a very good point. Correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, but I think patient recruitment is probably the number one reason for trials to take longer than expected. And then to your point, Philip, oncology trials, of course, today are mostly with a companion diagnostic. They are mostly selecting a subset patients with a given indication. So you're venturing a little bit into the unknown about how many patients have a particular mutation, for example, in their tumor or whatever you're searching for. So I wonder if that confidence level for startups who maybe not have gone through the process is just because of the expectation that this is going to be difficult, because it has become more and more difficult, I think, due to the reasons you talked about.
Just to kind of build on that, I'm going to ask Peter, if you were to pick your top 5 therapeutic areas, are there clear trends in areas that it's easier versus more difficult to recruit?
I'm not sure it goes along the lines of therapeutic expertise. I think there can be a lot of variability in the design of a trial in oncology versus CNS versus cardiovascular. So there are certainly differences across each therapeutic area, but even within a specific therapeutic area, it can be a fairly complex trial to recruit for a number of different reasons. I just fundamentally think that recruitment has always been a big problem, continues to be a big problem. And the only thing we know, if you take the world's experts and put them together and come up with a plan for a clinical trial, is that every single assumption that we've made with the best experts in the world are all 100% wrong, right? Recruitment is always faster or slower at every site. No site has ever recruited to a plan yet. So they either recruit faster than plan or lower than plan. You either need more sites or less sites, more countries, less countries. And so even if you had all the data in the world around seasonality from central labs and every sophisticated artificial intelligent recruitment tool, I still don't think you know what's really going to happen in that trial. And again, the only example I can ever think of where you've got some control over the clinical trial is, let's say it's a flu vaccine and you're able to isolate it and pump it into a room with 50 people. And guess what? Odds are almost all those 50 people are going to get sick. Running the exact same trial today versus a year ago at the same sites, again, it's a different patient population. And so we continue to use all sorts of tools, different databases, de-identified patient data from hospital networks. We keep trying to find that holy grail of patient recruitment, but I'm not sure in my lifetime that we're ever going to find it, because this is still just a highly variable and random process.
If it's okay, I'd like to just follow up on these comments. As it relates to clinical development, last week, Shailesh, our founder, and myself and Abe were in Seattle, and we had a room full of trailblazers, a number of folks that trailblazed immuno-oncology space. And we spent a lot of time talking about IO, gene cell therapies, gene editing. And as it relates to clinical development, the two challenges, one, and they felt like there was even a larger challenge was as it relates to clinical trial recruitment for patients, a lot of competition there. And then another area where that was specifically noted as challenging in clinical development as it relates to gene cell therapies, et cetera, in this space is long-term safety and efficacy data, which in this space we don't have. It takes time. Nonetheless, there's a relatively favorable regulatory environment that is helping to fast track some of this promising science. But to develop it further, we need the long-term safety and efficacy data, and that just takes time. And I just thought I'd share that. This was from last week's meeting, some real good insights with people who have trailblazed in a space that there continues to be a lot of energy around. And I know that's potentially a topic that we unpack for a subsequent discussion.
No, thank you, Dan. That good point, good insight, and thank you for sharing that relevant information. But looking into the second set of questions, what we were asking our respondents for was their confidence levels regarding regulatory processes in the major regions around the world. And as we look at this data, it might look like you would expect that we see a very high confidence level in the US with the FDA and the process. That's the highest, followed behind by Europe, and then Asia Pac, and then finally Latin America is lower. The thing that's interesting is a follow-up question showed, however, companies that had presence such as in Asia Pacific and Latin America, actually you see a differential or a gap. Their confidence in those regulatory processes in those regions are much higher than you would see for the whole sample. So in other words, if they had a presence in that local market, they also had a high confidence and their ability to address the regulatory process in that region. So I'll start off again, Peter, just from the point of just the overall confidence for all companies. Is that what you would expect? Obviously, US followed by UE, then Asia Pacific down to Latin America. But then that follow-up question is, well, if companies have corporate presence and they're confident in the regulatory process in those regions where they have presence, what can we do? How do we help those companies who don't have corporate presence to better navigate the regulatory process, the regulatory issues that are in those regions? Can we as CRO and consultants help these companies be better, and how do we help them there?
The first one's pretty easy. I think the confidence in the regional regulatory process, it seems to be aligned with where most of the research is done. US, EU, Asia Pac, to a smaller extent, Latin America. So I think that correlates with both where the research is going on in the world. It also correlates with where probably the amount of people in clinical research are located. So again, I think that seems to correlate really well. I was a little surprised by the second chart and some of the differences there. I mean, it's strange that you would, with a regional presence, you'd have less confidence in your regional regulatory process. So that kind of surprised me for the EU and US, but I definitely get the regulatory landscape within Asia Pacific and certainly Latin America are complex, are changing rapidly, and certainly with Latin America, very kind of relationship based and really, being able to understand the players and personnel and what's going on. So I think the people that really do have a good regional presence really understand that much more effectively. So that did make sense. Again, I think in places where the regulatory climate is still evolving and changing, and I wouldn't say coming up to world standards, but maybe getting more closely aligned with the way the FDA and European authorities regulate. I think it's much more important that you've got people on the ground there. Obviously, the European and US regulatory path, process, and rule set are much more established and much more robust. I'm not sure robust, but just much more experienced and pretty well known at this point.
I was thinking about that too. It's about process and established, but are there, again, you would know this better than us from Kineticos, would you say there's a noticeable difference in just some of the regulations and sort of how stringent one regulatory body is versus the next?
I'm not sure there's a universal scale. If you think about some of the standards of care in medical treatments in Latin America or maybe CIS regions of Europe versus EU, you find maybe not as much familiarity with ancillary equipment or tests or even ability to do certain kinds of tests. Again, there's a pretty wide variety of what is the standard of care for certain disease states throughout the world. So that leads you to the comfort and ability for a foreign regulatory body to approve work that you're going to go do in that individual country, right? Some are more willing to follow European and US regulatory approvals. If you get an approval in here or EU, it's much easier. But sometimes it's almost anti-correlated to that they almost need to have it proven to them that this is the right thing for their patients in their country to go follow. So it varies a lot. Variability, I think that's why you see such a large increase in confidence if someone has good regional presence in those locations. It just tells you really need to make sure you've got someone who really understands the landscape, not just the rules and regulations and published guidelines.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Because I was going to say, similar to your feedback, Peter, the first chart makes sense. And also I was thinking about by nature of the people that we surveyed, it was likely heavy in the U.S. And I think familiarity could have played a role in that, because just the less familiar someone is in a market, then that brings up uncertainty. And with uncertainty sometimes comes lack of confidence. But what you mentioned was a good point as well. And just the correlation between where the research is being done, I think makes sense. So I didn't have any more to add than that.
Maybe a follow-up question, because I found it interesting too. You do see that higher confidence when you're in that regional presence for Asia, PAC, and for Latin America. It dropped off somewhat with Europe and the US. And I didn't know if you think maybe there's a little bit of an overhang with some of the current political issues that are going on that might change how regulatory plays a role. I don't know if that might be something that we're seeing in the data. Would that be a fair question?
I can recall a couple of years ago, a lot of concern about Ukraine and fear, concern, and unknowing as to what the future holds. I think that's stabilized somewhat. I think the whole Brexit thing has kind of thrown everybody for a loop and trying to guess at what in the world's going to happen with British regulations versus EU regulations. And still not sure we fully know all of that, but I think that's evolving. So I do think that with some of those political changes and political winds of change, even if nothing changes in the end at all, that certainly provides some unease and nervousness. All the more reason you want someone on the ground who is doing this on a regular basis and understanding what's going on.
Okay, well, we'll move on. We're actually going to kind of combine the next two slides and sections. It's actually our third and fourth sets of questions. Looking at our respondents and their high confidence in commercial applications, what we asked our respondents for was confidence in key functions. Those key functions included around commercial were field sales, field reimbursement specialists, and how they were handling health economic outcome research or HERO capabilities. As we looked at that information, and you can see here on this slide, it shows that while there's a high level of importance shown by all of our respondents, there's definitely a discrepancy between that importance and what they consider to be their internal capabilities to execute. But interesting enough, as you move into the next slide showing this data, what you find is that while there is still what you would understand and would assume is there's a higher level with large companies placing a greater importance in field sales and have a greater confidence in their internal capabilities. What was unexpected was the fact that there's still a significant gap, even with your large to mid-sized companies versus startups and private. They seem to have what they believe is not only a higher level of importance and a higher level of capability, there's still a significant gap. So Dan, knowing your background and experience, I think seeing the importance versus the capabilities and this discrepancy between what they think is important but their capability to execute, is this something that makes sense? Does it fit with your experience? And then how can we help companies bridge this gap? How can we help them? But with even the larger companies, they have the experience of launching products. So why still the gap? And how do we help those large companies?
What we're seeing here relates to the relative importance of field sales, for example, and capability. My sense is 5 years out from now, that will change across big pharma. There has been for a number of years now much effort placed into omni-channel strategies, leveraging that is more than just field sales. And if we were to take a look at this data 10 years ago, the relative importance of field sales would be even higher. I expect 10 years from now that's going to decrease as some of our more traditional sales and marketing leadership evolves and moves on, and we have some of those who are trailblazing in the omni/multi-channel space, and we have more evidence about that working. As far as the capability gap, I believe that that's not surprising, and I believe that potentially will stay the same or potentially even decrease as it relates to field sales as we see the others increase, and that's because of physician access to field salespeople. That has declined, it's plateaued a bit, and with the utilization of alternative channels, digital contact center capabilities, et cetera. And as that begins to further evolve and there begins to be more increased evidence of physician access and utilization along those lines, this will look a little bit differently. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. I think there's also that question of as you look at field sales and how it's deployed in a evolving landscape and how you use those field salespeople to have the impact that you're hoping for, maybe not there. And then you start looking at some of these other areas, especially when you start looking at health economics and outcome research and what you're trying to accomplish there. We've gotten into an inflection point where we're looking for that pathway forward, and there's a little bit of unknown at this point. Exactly how do you redeploy and repurpose field cells and maybe even redefine what that means? And then how do you make sure that if you're going to invest in health economic and outcome research data, how do you make sure you get the greatest impact and positive, influence of putting time and resources into that? Maybe that's a little rhetorical in the statement versus a question, but do you think that's part of what's going on is we're at an inflection point where it's causing a lot of questions to be asked and concerns about what that pathway forward is?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think at the highest level, I don't think this will change. Our field representatives, whether it be on the commercial side or from a medical affairs perspective, are recognized as some of the most valuable resources we have, and lots of effort and focus on ensuring we free up that valuable capacity to focus on the best opportunities. And one way to do that is by integrating into the fabric of the sales and marketing plans and strategies, these alternative channels. As it relates to access and reimbursement, HEOR and the reimbursement specialist, I see the relative importance there continuing to increase. And the gap, I'm surprised a bit in this data where the gap is, isn't as big as I might thought it would be, because as the payer landscape evolves, and just on the topic that we talked about at the outset of the conversation around the energy around immuno-oncology, gene editing, the cell therapies, that's disrupting the payer system, trying to and provider economics, trying to solve for $1 to $2 million payments for a patient. Our current system isn't set up for that. And so increased investment and effort, in these particular areas, I would expect will continue to evolve, and it to be very important.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Kevin, I was going to ask anything from you to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, when I was looking at this data in a couple of ways, looking at, again, the private companies, which is the world that I live with the most, no surprise that there's a huge gap, right? Those companies are likely early in development and do just, recognize it's important, but it's not important to them for another 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So I think that wasn't surprising. But then when you talk about the large to mid-sized companies and still having a sizable gap there, again, not necessarily my area of expertise, but I wonder if it's somewhat similar to what we talked about above with the clinical development, CMC, and patient recruitment, that organizations recognize that it's important, but if they don't have the capabilities internally, they're confident they can go out and find solutions for these other, channels that Dan spoke of, right? Where, you're talking to call centers and where you're not relying as heavily on your FTE and your kind of core footprint to where, so the gap may be bigger than what we expected. I guess the question behind that is should it be alarming, or is it just people telling us, hey, it's important, we're not good at it, but we're going to go find someone else who's good at it, get it done for us?
Fair enough. Anything before we move on? I did want to open it up if there were any comments or.
Yeah, I'd like to just chime in. I mean, we certainly don't do a lot of commercial work, but I think the piece that we see is really looking at real world evidence, health economics, patient reported outcomes, really looking at the effectiveness of some of these treatments. I mean, I've been in the industry for a while. In the beginning of my career at a large pharma company, medical affairs and clinical were pretty much forbidden to speak to each other. In fact, encouraged not to speak to each other, and create barriers and walls. And part of it was clinical does things in a big, expensive, heavy-handed way. And so they didn't understand some of the smaller, more nimble, nuanced medical affairs trials that medical affairs was running to try and create some additional value and understand the outcomes of their trial. Clinical, on the other hand, didn't want medical affairs to be doing that work because they were worried about potentially impacting, a drug. I mean, look at Belviq that was just pulled from the market this week, right? So ideally, everyone is ethical and wants to know, but the more trials you run, the more risk you run of finding something about your drug that you maybe didn't want to know. And so there were concerns from both sides why they wouldn't cooperate and play together. I think the world is dramatically different today. I mean, I think we've run, probably in the last 6 months, we've probably run half-day workshops for a number of emerging to mid-sized biotechs where we actually bring clinical and medical affairs together and understand the amount of commercial value you can create, and how do you look at some of the health economic outcome data and create real meaningful commercial value before the launch of a drug with very little effort or cost associated with adding on to a clinical development program, and also helping medical affairs understand some of the potential clinical value they can create when they are running some of their post-marketing studies. And so I think both sides have really come much closer together. And I think that I think that's good for the industry. I think it's good for the efficiency of bringing new treatments to market, and then really understanding, most importantly, do these therapeutics really work, and are they truly adding meaningful value to the patients in the marketplace?
Yeah, I agree with you, Peter. I think it's good to see over the last few years that border between commercial and medical become more porous. That firewall that persisted for many years, I don't think was good for anybody, including the patients.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, Dan, is I think in some cases, some of the original firewalls and concerns are now giving way to making understand if we're going to be patient-centric in the way that we handle healthcare. If it's good for the patient, then we've got to reconsider some of these firewalls that were built for other reasons. Do what's right for the patient. So all great content, all great comments. Thank you, especially Peter. That was great. Thank you for adding that. Why don't we move forward and we're going to jump into kind of our final and fifth set of questions. This really had to do with where we are with where clinical trials are being run. So looking at that fifth set of questions, what we asked of our CEOs and executive leaders was about their confidence pertaining to their clinical trials and where they plan to perform clinical trials, looking at the major regions around the world. If you look at those locations of clinical trials, it does pretty much, at least with the first data set, pretty much mirrors the confidence in the regulatory processes that we spoke about earlier as far as those regions in the world. There's some confidence in making this comment that it also matches the size of the markets. The interesting thing, though, with the second set of data is locations for clinical trials are roughly similar across three types of the companies, but startups, for some reason, are planning more Asian PAC than European clinical trials. And this is more than any other type of company. Just kind of experience and understanding of what clinical trials look like in general, but is it surprising that the startups would have more of a broad kind of geographic view and reach of clinical trials? And one thing to kind of recognize, and maybe even Tom, you can speak to this a little bit, as I understand the survey data only showed that 14% of startups have any kind of corporate presence outside of North America, but yet they're the ones that they're telling they're going to push more of their clinical trials outside of North America. Is that true to the data that you saw, Tom?
Yeah, that's kind of where this chart came from as a surprise. I did want to double check that we didn't have a lot of startups that were in Asia Pacific, so that would kind of go back to our previous slide around confidence in regulatory systems. So it just does seem odd to me that startups who you think would be very focused on a certain market, have a limited funding, would be so broad geographically. And I was kind of just wondering if Peter and Kevin could comment on whether shouldn't be a surprise, or is that not what they would have expected? Smaller companies, especially Kevin, I guess, with his focus on smaller companies.
I'll touch on it. I think Peter probably be able to give more insight into clinical trial, but just from a geographic reach, it does surprise me. And as I was prepping for this panel, trying to think of what could be driving this, and I struck out quite honestly. I think what I would have expected was for startups and even potentially private companies that you start with, number one, where you're familiar with. I'm sure the sample was highly focused in the U.S. Also focus where the more established regulatory processes are as well. And so, again, I thought this was a surprise, but I'd be curious if Peter has a different view on why we may have seen this data set look like this.
I'm a little surprised. It's tough. I'd love to figure out who answered and go back and ask him some follow-up questions. One of the things that our Chief Scientific Officer, Dr. Murphy, says is therapeutic areas and drugs are becoming more orphanized. And so something I've been telling people is my great-grandfather might have been crazy, but my grandfather had some sort of dementia, but we didn't know. But now my father's got Alzheimer's. And so I think as we've started to understand some of these disease states, and there's Alzheimer's, Parkinson's with dementia, Parkinson's hallucinations, dementia Lewy body dementia, two different diseases with the same words in their name. I think we're starting to realize that not just one drug can treat everything. And so I think we're getting more specialized in different patient populations, different regions. I think sometimes people go to other countries purposefully to maybe avoid the US as their initial, like, hey, let's go prove it and get approval in a smaller area first, and then come back at a larger market and prove some value for an inflection point to go raise additional funds? I think there's probably a number of different reasons. I'm not sure there's any one kind of magic bullet answer to why this is happening. I do think the Asia Pacific, I mean, Chinese companies bringing drugs to the US, companies looking to go tap into the Chinese market, I think that is accelerating rapidly. I think there's a lot of interesting new things. Folks with Chinese remedies that have been used for literally thousands of years, long before the drug industry ever existed. And there are players in China running, real clinical trials with pretty serious implications into treatments and outcomes for patients based on plant-based and other herbal remedies and things like that. So I think the world is just getting much more complex, and I think the reasons for going to different countries is more complex. So I'm not sure I have an answer, but it doesn't surprise me.
One thing struck me on both these last two discussions we've had is whether the nature of innovation is changing a little bit in this business. I mean, we tend to think of innovation meaning a new drug, new MOA, or something like that. I'm wondering if companies, especially small companies, maybe are using other things as innovative ways to get into the market, maybe using a health economics approach that is different to, even if their drug isn't so different. Maybe going to these smaller markets, as Peter just talked about, to prove it, or maybe the smaller market is where their approach would be successful. So I'm kind of wondering whether we see with companies that it's not just, hey, I've got a new drug and it's going to act differently than the old drugs, but I've got a new way of potentially bringing the drug to market, new markets that need drugs like this. As you pointed out, Peter, smaller markets, orphan drug markets. Whether we need to kind of expand our thoughts on what innovation in biopharma is today. Just kind of thinking through as we've been discussing these different points.
I completely agree with you. I think the amount of innovation and creativity, I think we are in a bold new frontier of treatments and regimens beyond gene therapies and stem cell treatments. I saw the social media posts that you guys did with Locus Biosciences. I mean, engineered bacteriophages, weaponized stem cell treatments, gene therapies, orphanization of indications, further understanding of the human body. I mean, some of these disease areas that we're treating, we don't even really understand how the diseases come about and how our drugs actually, the mechanism of action in the body. There's so little we understand. I think the next 10, 20, 30 years are going to be mind-blowing from a discovery and understanding, and then, I think just further the advancements of other treatments and true meaningful outcomes to patients.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best way, given the time to end it. My comment was tangential, Tom. It was related to the company. We just did a project, and a company was running a dry eye trial in Mexico. Again, they were going for FDA approval, but part of the reason they were going down there was there was a rich patient population, and I think they felt like they could expedite their approval process if they enrolled quicker and conducted the trial quicker. And saving 6 months to a year in clinical development program can translate to several, tens of hundreds of $1 million. So again, that's tangential to the innovation comment, but I think there's a logistics play that might be affecting some of this data as well.
Yeah, and Kevin, I was going to add, I think we also had another example where we were working with a company that was looking to bring a product to market that was focused on gastric cancer. And the prevalence of gastric cancer in the Asian Pacific market is so much higher than anywhere else. They felt like the available population to address and the need for therapeutic in that market made sense to go into that market first.
Yeah, exactly right. They were a Chinese-based company, but their intent was to launch and establish their beachhead in the Chinese market, just given the prevalence, and then work backwards, not backwards, but against what the traditional route is, and then come get into the U.S. after that. So that's a good point, Philip.
All right. Well, thank everybody for joining us. Peter, Kevin, Dan, and Tom, great conversation, great insights, great discussion. Interesting enough, we kind of ended with this idea of, there's new frontiers and new approaches to and advancements and what's driving how companies decide where they're going to decide what is their beachhead as they bring product to the market. We'll jump into our next section next week and bring that to everybody. Section 2 actually is the impact of new technologies and new potentially innovative approaches to market. So it's kind of a perfect segue from where we ended here. We'll pick it up next week.
Thank you for listening to our Biopharma Confidence Index webinar. Just as Philip mentioned, this is the first in our series, so check back soon for the next one. And if you would like to learn more about Worldwide and the services we can provide, go to worldwide.com. For more information on Kineticos, please go to kineticos.com. Thank you.